we will move on now to Tobias Holzlehner from Martin Luther University in Halle, Germany, who will give a talk on wild rhizome, Zenshin, Panax ginseng, forest landscapes, and foraging at the margins of Chinese capitalism.
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, thank you, Sayana and Natalia, for inviting me. I was first a little bit hesitant to join because my fieldwork in this area and on these topics lay back for almost more than 10 years, or well, in different stages. But after all, I'm very glad actually I committed to it, because it helped me to really rethink my fieldwork material. I've been doing work in the Russian-Chinese borderland, Primore region, mostly on topics of informal economy. And this perspective of this very workshop helped me to kind of switch my focus in that sense. I'm trying to rejuvenate my old fieldwork material with a plant's eyes view in a sense. But let me just jump right into the topic here. I want to talk here about ginseng, mostly wild ginseng. And I first stumbled over or encountered ginseng during fieldwork in 2004 in Vladivostok, while I was just planning a trip with a friend of mine to his father's garden dacha in the mountains, in the Sikhote-Alin mountains, just 50 miles north of Vladivostok. And but the father was hesitant, and he didn't really wanted to have strangers on his little dacha, so eventually we never went. But the point was that he had a couple of ginseng plants there. He was guarding and nurturing for years now, and he took them as a sort of savings account. And so this was really an investment for him, which he tried to protect from prying eyes of strangers. In addition, I heard all these different stories, taiga stories, so to say, of people defending their ginseng plots in the mountains, hunting Chinese collectors and poachers. And so this all like spurred my interest in this topic. But let me just very briefly introduce you a little bit to the biology and ecology of this plant. There are essentially three major ginseng species which are traded worldwide. This is Korean ginseng, Chinese ginseng, and American ginseng. The most valuable is Korean ginseng. Maybe to just highlight a couple of few things. Panax ginseng is a native of the mountainous region of Manchuria and North Korea and the Russian Far East. It's a perennial which loves to have shaded areas. So it actually depends on a relatively complex forest ecosystem to survive and to bear roots. Ginseng, wild ginseng, is normally harvested after 2 to 5 years. And there's and also this connects directly to Daniel's talk here. There's where I can see a lot of similarities. But the main point is here that there is a big difference, especially in value and therefore potency, of a farmed ginseng and wild ginseng. And wild ginseng is almost extinct in China and in Korea too. I'm not sure about North Korea so much, but there are only essentially 2 places in the world where still wild ginseng is harvested. This is the Sikhote-Alin mountain ranges, the Ussuri region, formerly called the Ussuri region, and back then, and then ginseng, wild ginseng is collected in the Appalachian Mountains. I'll come to this later. And this also is reflected in the value and of the commodity of ginseng. Chinese distinguish between 3 different types of ginseng, while the mountain wild ginseng is considered to be the most valuable. Here you have an image here of the peculiar shady forest ecosystem where ginseng thrives. Although this image is not from the Russian Far East, but it's from the Appalachian Mountains. It's Western Maryland. But I especially like this. It's a really nice photographer here. A peculiar thing is with ginseng consumption is that to speak with Marx here, it reaches like a fetish value in that sense. Here you can see an auction of a ginseng root for $500,000. The point is here, and I'm being really briefly because I want to cover quite a bit of topics here. The interesting thing is that besides its medicinal value in Chinese traditional medicine, it has this second symbolic value, which means the more anthropomorphic a ginseng root looks like, the more valuable it is. And it's not only the anthropomorphic appearance, but also, and here it gets really complicated, and Korean judge ginseng differently than Chinese. It has something to do with the proportions between the main root and the little side roots, and so there's all different value regimes essentially attached to ginseng. It is consumed as a food beverage, as a dietary supplement, and then especially the wild ginseng is heavily used in Chinese medicine, and therefore the name's Panax ginseng. It's a panacea, it's a cure-all. It's a tonic, it's a stimulant, and although Western medicine is still, the verdict is still open about the potency, the Western medicinal potency of ginseng. And in the following talk here, I want to follow this rhizome in a double sense. First of all, I want to follow this plant historically, but also, and here in a more Deleuzian way, I want to follow the rhizomic appearance. So I'm really intentionally using here Deleuze and Guattari's term of the rhizome to highlight here the planar and transspecies connections this root developed or develops along. And culturally driven demand for wild ginseng in China has therefore produced far-ranging trading and foraging economies along its borders. And that mostly here in remote forest and mountain landscapes, mostly mediated through local hunters, poachers, and then Chinese middlemen and Chinese traders. And one of my main points is here that the notions of wild and wilderness are constituent here to the root's commodified value, and here especially in relation to farm ginseng. That means that it is sourced in the wild market of native foraging, informal cross-barter market, Diki Rinok, and but at the same time, it's also rooted in the wild potency ascribed here to the specific variety of ginseng. And Daniel also already mentioned this, that in Chinese traditional medicine, wild objects have so much more power, key, and therefore efficiency and potency. So let me begin here, a little bit of history here, historic excursion. Ginseng is the harvest of wild ginseng is really closely connected to the expansion of the Qing dynasty into the Russian Far East. It was considered to be in the 17th century, 18th century, to be one of the 3 riches of Manchuria: pearls, ginseng, and sable. And there was this complex system the Qing dynasty already established to collect, license, and permit ginseng collecting. When the Russian Empire advanced into this region, and here I have you have a couple of images from Arseniev's books on the Russian Far East here. You can see in these images Russian game wardens burning down Chinese poaching camps. And here you see the three main products during that time. You can see left sea cucumber, I will get to this later too, and ginseng, and then panti, like antlers in velvet. Daniel mentioned them before too here. But to be really brief here, there's of course this economic aspect and this imperial aspect, but already in early ethnographies, and I think an interesting aspect appears here of which speaks to the human-animal relationship. And here, and I'm not reading you the whole thing, but I want to stress here that the ginseng hunters are ascribed to be already wild. They are men who have transformed themselves into special beings, gifted with the intelligence and cunning of the Chinese, with a wolf's scent, a falcon's sight, a hare's hearing, and a tiger's quickness. So here it is really this becoming animal, becoming wild due to the proximity to this wild resource. And I think this is an interesting point, and I would like to come to that later. But besides this notion of wildness here, it was a relatively complex, and I've published on this in other forms, but I just want to highlight this here. This is information extracted from Arseniev's work. It shows you a little bit the highly structured trade in bioresources. First, ginseng, antlers in velvet, sea cucumber, and tiger parts at the turn of the last century, like 18th to 19th, 19th to 20th century. And this was highly stratified and organized mostly due to trading, Chinese trading guilds. Yeah, well, and due to time, I want to jump here really quickly into the post-socialist area, where I found this rather, and then here you have a couple of images of the Sikhote-Alin mountain range, remote and up to today, very hard to access region. And suddenly, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, very similar resource extract patterns re-emerged, like almost resembling those 100 years earlier described by Arseniev. And so you have, again, Chinese middlemen in the backcountry buying up from local poachers and local hunters different bioresources, in here especially wild ginseng. Then you have this elaborate smuggling, these elaborate smuggling networks. Here you can have a couple of images from customs agency, and you can see those. They've been hidden in pipes, in exhaust pipes, in cars, that therefore this shape. So it's a really lucrative business, exporting those. Exporting this ginseng, which is on the red list, to China, and here also there's it's not that easy in terms of how poachers, local poachers, Russian poachers, that are actually viewed. There is of course this notion that they are selling out the richnesses of Russia to the hungry Chinese, and you can imagine the play on stereotypes here, that they're essentially like extracting a very rare resource for their own gain. But there's a slightly different view where and this is and this citation is here a reflection on that, where people in the backcountry, they've been mostly left out by the boom of the 1990s or the 2000s, the economic boom, and so this is often in their cases one of the only instances they could actually earn some real good money, and therefore, and here you have like a poacher who essentially says this, no? that this is an important income for my family. Without this, I couldn't send my daughter to school, or with that, I would have hardly any retirement money. So there is a economic incentive behind this. So and this aspect I found interesting. Yeah, this moral economy aspect in this trade here, and these are, and I traveled with traders into Heilongjiang province here. This is Yilin province in Hunchun, and these are the stores where you can buy ginseng from the Russian Far East, and this also tells you that ginseng is part of a larger trade network, or like Carol Nordstrom talks about multi-layered routes. So there's all different resources which are attached to this trade. And those stores are called foods of local origin. Here you have dried frogs in these little gift boxes, or these slices in those jars are actually panti, these bloodshot antlers from young deers. And here you see the different border crossings, and I'm almost here at the I'm running into time problems, therefore I'm speeding this up. And this would be here, and I'm being really quick here. This would be one of the instances where I would call a rhizomic appearance in form of a different animal here. And this is sea cucumbers. Here you can see sea cucumber poachers. And the interesting part is here, and that's the connection to Shenzhen, is here that it's considered to be underwater ginseng. So it has essentially the same properties, but underwater. And here, very similar features of a complex appear. Highly valuable, big difference between farmed and wildly caught, smuggling networks, and here highly specialized stores in China. This one is only selling dried cucumbers, and the kilogram price is here at, this was 2013, $1,600 the kilogram. So it's a highly lucrative income. And also here at the end, this is my second rhizome, where I see this human-animal relationship in a very similar way reappearing. And this is you don't have to watch this show. It's like one of those reality shows where masculinity, wilderness, and animals and plants have this really strange attraction to some of those people. And this place in absolute hillbilly country. I'm not so sure if you're familiar with the socio-economic geography of the US, but the Appalachian Mountains is a very remote and very poor area in the US with indices. You would only health indices and economic indices, which would remind you of a third world country. And here, this is one of the major sources of wild ginseng. For 90%, more than 90% of the collected ginseng is exported to China, mostly via Hong Kong. This is the area where ginseng is collected. And here I also want to highlight here this very little, this moral aspect, or these two aspects I see. There's one of extraction, and exploitation, but also one of care and taking care of plants. And well, this shows you just the price and availability. I want to. This is from a guidebook by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where they highlight that good stewardship of wild ginseng means using and promoting sustainable harvest practices. So this is because, as in other regions, the wild ginseng is declining very rapidly, and here also. And I want to highlight this little quote, and then coming to an end here, that lots of families around here shared knowledge about the location of wild herb colonies, like ginseng patches, and they cared for them year after year. Safeguarding herbs is a family tradition. So there's this aspect of safeguarding, stewardship, and extraction, which are colliding in the US, although in the Russian Far East. And as a very, bear with me another 1 minute, this is why I call it departures, because actually working on this theme again actually produced more questions and more departures than conclusions. But I highlighted this notions of wild and wilderness, an important aspect of the value of this, and then there are these very specific ginseng landscapes, which are through history here marked, and I'm using here James C. Scott's term of marked by frictions of distance and terrain. So they're really places at the edges of empire. And what I found really interesting, and I'm trying to wrap my mind around, is this co-evolvement and of this human-plant interactions. That on the one hand, of course, people take care of these plants, but it seems to me the plant has also a very strong influence of how people here, and here specifically ginseng, how people treat it, how people trade it. And it's almost that ginseng landscapes produce very similar socio-economic contexts or complexes. And part of this is this relationship between care and exploitation in these multi-species landscapes. And thank you for your patience, and I'll finish it by here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tobias. It's a very interesting topic. I have to first just apologize. It seems like my neighbors have decided they wanted to start hammering today, which is not great. But I hope you'll bear with me. So I just wanted to ask, first of all, while listening to that, I was reminded of, I don't know if you're aware of, there's a podcast from Planet Money, an episode where they trace the Appalachian the commodity chains in the Appalachians, which was also very amusing because the reporter goes to a local person who's trying to grow wild ginseng, so imitate the wildness of the ginseng at their home to see if they can do it. And the conclusion was no, so maybe that's why you couldn't enter that person's hut, that they're probably trying to do the same thing. But I wanted to ask a question off of that, is how is wild, so it's interesting with commodity chains because they and also with Daniel's research, they kind of thrive off of difference, local difference, but they're at the same time like a commodification avenue. So I wanted to ask, how is wild standardized through these commodity chains? So like when people take the wild route, how do they standardize wildness, essentially? Would be my first question. And then my other question would just be, does the Qing still influence why wild is considered more potent because of the idealization of the wildness during the Qing dynasty? So, thank you.
Wow, thank you for your question. These are difficult questions for me to answer because I'm not a Chinese speaker, I have to admit, and this would be a question to a sinologist or like an anthropologist doing work in China, but I try to briefly address this. Maybe I want to address your very first comment about your comment about this, that he tried to create this wild environment. And I think this is an interesting aspect. There's this hybrid in between farmed and absolutely wild. There's a wild simulated category where people try to arrange the forest habitat in that sense that it's conducive to wild ginseng, and they often transplant wild ginseng to those semi-cared, semi-wild forest plots. So there is an influence, and then it would still be considered wild. But your first question, how is wildness operationalized or commodity, and this has been a question I posed myself too, especially sometimes ginseng from the Russian Far East is smuggled already in powder form across the border. And I don't think you can see it in the chemical compounds if it's wild grown or not. But I think, and maybe some people have more information, that wild grown ginseng has just a different root structure. It's way more anthropomorphic and larger. And and then, I mean, the other thing is, I think in those informal smuggling networks, trust plays a different, very important role. Trust in your middleman, trust in your networks, but there's also trust there must be a trust of a consumer buying a highly valuable ginseng root, knowing that it's a wild ginseng root. But frankly speaking, I'm not really sure how this trust is created or how this category of wild is assured in that sense. So
I think if I remember correctly from the podcast, you actually can see on a micro level the difference between organic, wild, and farmed, which is one of the reasons, which was why the guy was trying to trick people. Okay. And that was the whole point. But yeah, it'd be interesting to follow up on that. Anyway, thank you. Sayana, would you like to ask?
It seems to me that this trade in bioresources between Russia and China, let's say starting from this imperial period, it kind of indicates this kind of power relations and disbalance between these two. And for example, for a long period, China was kind of a trading tea to Russia and to Europe. And at the same time, you wouldn't believe, Russians were bringing timber from northern Mongolia, because timber in northern Mongolia was less expensive than timber on the Russian side at the late imperial period. So I think that it's kind of very interesting indicators of the power shift. And in this case, so now we kind of, from previous presentations, we learn how things are brought to China from Russia, which kind of shows kind of it's growing maybe economic dependencies on Russia on China. But in your case, was ginseng kind of smuggled and from China to Russia and consumed in Russia at some period, like, or no?
Well, not to my knowledge. Well, I know people use it, like Russians use it in the backcountry, but in a very, let's say, compared to the Chinese tradition, in a very unsophisticated way. So they would just preserve it in vodka or like in honey, and they actually do it exactly the same with sea cucumbers. I've met a couple of people who have this big jar of honey where there's a sea cucumber in it, and every day they eat like 1 spoon of honey. But it seems, well, it would be interesting, and I'm not sure if the native population in this area, the Udege and so on and so forth, if they have used it. It is known from North America that the Iroquois used ginseng, American ginseng, in their traditional healing practices. but in this case, it seems to be that this is really that the Chinese demand produced this market, and not that it wasn't like a local, or there is like a large local usage of it.
Thank you.
Sorry.
All right, so we have two more questions. First, Tatiana, and then Daniel.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. It was fascinating. I have a question, or actually I want to loop back to Hedwig's question and this question of wildness versus domestication and cultivation. So I'm sure you're aware there's a huge kind of body of literature on this in Soviet like phytopharmacology, which is trying to distinguish between the properties of plants that have grown in the wild and the properties of plants that have been cultivated, and the differences about like the sort of, you know, phytochemical content being sort of mediated by insect predation and other kinds of sort of growing conditions. So I wonder if that might be a way to kind of think about this rhizomatic question that you're bringing up in relation to sort of you know, the local kind of ecological environmental entanglements with other sort of non-plant, non-human others, whether be they animals or insects, etc., and whether there are some kinds of discourses around that that you've heard from your informants in the field.
Well, I take it more like as a comment, and I think this is, I hadn't thought about this, about the and this, I think this is not even, this is not well, the focus on the pharmaceutical focus on wild versus non-wild in Soviet literature. I think this extends to the post-Soviet period. I've stumbled over a couple of Russian authors who exactly like deal with this in a way, and this is interesting, in a way more non-judgmental ways like Western medicinal scholars or biologists would treat it. Here, interesting, it's really like very parallel is the discussion about the potency of sea cucumbers, where there's also this big puzzlement in Western science. How do we deal with those potencies which we cannot really pin down like on a chemical formula or something like this, and but in terms of the wild discourse, or like local discourses on wild and non-wild, well, I think this is all a reflection of the Chinese market, and I know that there is a distinction, in a value distinction of ginseng collected in the backcountry of the Sikhote-Alin, and which is more remote compared to the coastal area. And this is this 20% value difference, for example. This is one of my informants told me, because the more remote, the more, but I think these are really important categories, and handed down through Chinese middlemen and to Russian poachers and hunters.
Daniel?
Yes, thank you. I was consulting the question of wilderness with the local healers, and their answer was it's more connected to the spiritual world, because the wild plants are connected to the are exposed to the elements of nature freely. Without they are gaining their power from the soil, from the rain, from the sun, without humans' influence. So this is because they are more potent than the agricultural plants. That was their answer from the locals. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just off of that, what Daniel said, it sounds to me like they're recreating a division between the nature and culture. I don't know if that's the untouched nature themselves, but just interesting tidbit. All right, well, thank you for a very interesting talk, Tobias. There's a lot of rhizomatic potentiality with that project. And